They told me to ask my daughter for money. My own son had $12 million sitting in a bank account, and his mother told me to go beg a fourth-grade teacher instead. That sentence sat in my chest like a rock I'd swallowed whole. I was 58 years old, and I didn't say a word back. But before I tell you what happened next, understand this. It was never really about the money. It was about who shows up when you have nothing left to offer. I live in a small 3-bedroom house off FM 762 in Rosenberg, Texas. The kind you buy young thinking you'll flip it into something bigger. Never happened. It was a hot Tuesday night in late July when my wife Caroline's phone rang, and her whole face changed, like someone flipped a switch behind her eyes. "Richard, honey, tell me everything," she sang, turning her back to me like I was a draft she needed to shut out. I sat there listening to her gush over our son closing a $12 million account like he'd cured cancer. When she hung up, the smile dropped off her face like a mask coming off. She slid the overdue electric bill across the table without asking if I was okay, without mentioning the cough I'd had for 3 weeks. "Fix this," she said, before they cut it off again. Again, like I was the pattern. Here's the truth. The ugly kind. 10 years ago, I wasn't some deadbeat who blew the family savings gambling. I was a small-time real estate investor, and a good one. I sank everything into 60 acres of raw land out past Simonton, land that sat right in the path of the future Grand Parkway expansion. Then a pipeline ruptured on a neighboring property, crude oil bled into the water table, and my land got locked under a federal cleanup order before I ever broke ground. Couldn't sell it, couldn't build on it, could only bleed property taxes while my credit circled the drain. Banks pulled my lines of credit. My business partner walked, and Caroline never once asked if I was okay, only how I planned to fix it. I've been driving a forklift at a warehouse off Highway 36 ever since, 6 days a week, coming home smelling like cardboard and diesel. Our son Richard turned 21 right around then, and decided his whole life had been ruined because I couldn't afford his spring break trip to Destin. He's never forgiven me. Maybe he needed a villain, and I was standing right there. My daughter is different. Melissa is 26, teaches 4th grade in Katy, 20 minutes from here. She was 16 when the spill happened, old enough to remember what we lost, young enough to watch me rebuild, instead of just mourning it. 2 nights after that phone call, she showed up with a foil pan of chicken and rice, my favorite, heavy on the cumin, and never once mentioned Richard's $12 million. She just kissed the top of my head and told me I was seeing a doctor Thursday. I didn't argue, never much point arguing with Melissa. Dr. Ferris wasn't smiling when he came back into the exam room. A mass on my lung. Operable, but it needed to come out in weeks, not months. Then the woman from billing walked in and told me there was a gap in my coverage. $3,500, due before they'd even schedule the operating room. I sat in my truck in that parking lot doing the math 6 different ways, and it always came out the same. I didn't have it. So I told myself for 2 full days that I wouldn't call my son. Then I called him anyway, because that's what a father does. He picked up with glasses clinking in the background, some woman laughing about a bottle of Macallan. "Dad, can this wait? We're celebrating the Hendricks account." I told him everything, the mass, the surgery, the $3,500 I needed by the end of the week. A long pause, then his voice went flat and cold. "I just spent 10 years digging out of the hole your bad investments put this family in. Ask the hospital for a payment plan. I've got a reputation to protect now. I can't keep carrying your dead weight." The line went dead. My son hung up on me in a hospital parking lot so he could get back to his scotch. I called Caroline next, hoping she'd soften him up. "Don't you dare ruin this for him," she snapped. "Go ask Emma." She meant Melissa. After all those years, she still couldn't get our daughter's name right when she was busy being angry at me. I met Melissa 2 days later at a diner off Highway 90. I hadn't planned on telling her. I was ashamed to even sit across from my 26-year-old daughter and ask for money her own brother had refused without blinking. I never finished the sentence. She already knew. She set an envelope on the table, turned her phone around to show me a payday loan approval for $1,500. "There's $2,000 cash in there too," she said. "I sold the Civic this morning." I told her, "Cars can be replaced." She grabbed my hand and said, "You can't." I wept in that diner in front of the whole lunch crowd. She's the only one who ever really saw me. They wheeled me into pre-op at 6 that Thursday morning, Melissa's face the last thing I remember before the anesthesia took me under. "You're going to be fine, old man." I woke up 11 hours later with a tube down my throat, and Dr. Ferris telling me they'd gotten it all. Clean margins. I thought about Melissa's car sitting on some dealer's lot, with another family's name on the title, bought with a $1,500 loan and a car she needed for work. I made myself a promise right there. I don't care how long it takes. I'm going to make this right. I spent the next 2 weeks recovering on Melissa's pull-out couch in her one-bedroom apartment near her school, because Caroline never texted once to ask how the surgery went. Every morning I looked at the bus schedule Melissa had taped to her fridge. She'd sold her only car for me and was riding a city bus at 6:40 a.m., while Richard leased an Audi to drive to steakhouses. She'd come home in her teacher clothes, check my incision, heat up something simple, and never once complain, never once ask when I'd pay her back. Richard gives because he wants credit. Melissa gives because it never even occurs to her that it's giving. 16 days after surgery, the mail carrier knocked instead of leaving it in the box. 2 certified letters. One from the EPA, the address I'd been dreading for a decade. I almost set it aside unopened, expecting another update telling me nothing had changed. Instead, remediation complete, site released from federal oversight. 10 years. 10 years of taxes on land I couldn't touch. 10 years of my credit in the gutter. 10 years of my own wife looking at me like a stain on the family. Done. In black and white. The second letter was from Cornerstone Golf Development. While my land sat locked up, the Grand Parkway expansion I'd bet everything on a decade too early had finally happened right past my property line. 60 acres of worthless, oil-stained swamp were now zoned commercial, a half-mile from a brand-new interchange. $15 million cash. 30-day close. I didn't whoop or holler. I sat very still and looked up at that bus schedule on the fridge, Melissa's handwriting in the corner, and something in me went quiet and cold and clear. I didn't call Caroline. I didn't call Richard. Why would I, when 3 weeks earlier they'd made it very clear whose problem I was? I called Larry Foster instead, the one professional who'd stuck with me through the worst of it. I told him everything, and then I told him what I really wanted, to pull the partition and exchange agreement Caroline had signed 5 years earlier, the one Richard himself had pushed for. Larry called back 2 hours later and read it to me word for word. Caroline Hunt waives, releases, and forever discharges any and all claim, present or future, to the real property in Fort Bend County, regardless of cause. Regardless of cause. 5 years ago, scared the bank might come after her assets because of my land debt, Caroline had taken the house and her accounts as her sole separate property and forced me to take full sole ownership of that debt-ridden land. Richard's idea, sold to her as smart, protective. He'd even signed as a witness. Whatever happened to that land now, good or bad, she'd already signed away every claim to it. I sat at Melissa's kitchen table in the afternoon light and felt something that wasn't shame or grief for the first time in 10 years. It was clarity. I want to move on the offer, I told Larry. Quiet. Not a soul outside this call knows, especially not Caroline and Richard. Draw up a trust alongside the sale. Irrevocable. In Melissa's name. The whole $15 million. Every dime after my debts are paid. Larry paused. All of it, Boris? She sold her car for me. She took out a predatory loan so I could have surgery. She rode a bus at 6:40 in the morning for weeks so I'd have somewhere to heal. While my son told me to ask the hospital for a payment plan, and my wife told me not to ruin his celebration. Fair already happened, in a diner off Highway 90, and only one of my children showed up for it. They found out 8 days later, not from me, but from a commercial property registry Richard was combing through for his own reasons. He came pounding on Melissa's door with Caroline behind him, sweat on his collar, tie loosened, no mention of my surgery, no mention of the scar still tender under my shirt. $15 million cash, he said, voice cracking. You've had this 9 days and didn't call your own son? I reminded him exactly where I was the last time I called, sitting in a hospital parking lot while he celebrated a commission and told me it wasn't his problem. That should have softened him. It didn't. He accused me of hiding a fortune, of making his mother drive a 10-year-old Camry, while I sat on millions and planned to hand it all to my favorite kid. Caroline chimed in, called me vindictive, cruel, stingy. a word that almost made me laugh, coming from a man who'd refused his father $3,500 for cancer surgery. Then came the real reason they'd shown up. Not the land at all, not yet. Richard was drowning in some mess of his own and needed money badly enough to walk into his broke father's temporary bedroom on his sister's pull-out couch. "We're not asking anymore," he said, voice dropping mean. "Mom's filing for divorce tomorrow, financial abandonment. My lawyer's drafting a motion to freeze every account connected to that sale. You hid marital assets, Dad. That's fraud." He slammed his fist on Melissa's kitchen table, the same table where she'd once slid me an envelope of cash without a second thought. I stood up slow, reached into my jacket, and slid the partition agreement across to Caroline. Watched the color drain out of her face as she read her own signature, her own lawyer's language, the phrase, "regardless of cause." "You didn't just protect yourself from my failure," I told her. "You converted that land into my sole separate property. You signed away any future claim to it, on your own son's advice." Richard still wasn't done, still insisting he'd take me to court. So I slid him the second document, Melissa's bank statement. $12. "That's what's in your sister's account right now, Richard, because 3 weeks ago, she sold her car and took out a loan at 22% interest, so I could get on an operating table, while you ordered $300 scotch to celebrate a commission. I told him to bring every lawyer in Fort Bend County if he wanted, but he'd have to explain to a judge how he planned to claim assets his own mother waived in writing 5 years ago, on his own advice, and where exactly he'd been the night his father needed $3,500 for cancer surgery." Silence. Just the window unit humming and a neighbor's television bleeding through the ceiling. "I didn't hide this to be petty," I said, my voice finally coming down soft and tired. "I kept it quiet, because I needed time to make sure it went to the only person who actually earned it. The trust is already finalized, irrevocable. The full $15 million goes to Melissa, all of it. I told them Larry had already burned Melissa's predatory loan to ash, paid off her apartment complex, funded the tutoring program she'd been dreaming about, and had a car waiting for her, nicer than the one she sold. You're both officially free of my mistakes now, I said. Isn't that what you wanted? For 10 years I heard how I ruined this family. Well, the failure's over, and it turns out you signed yourselves right out of everything that came after it. Get out of my daughter's home. They left without a slammed door, without a last word, just two people walking out, realizing in real time that the very cleverness Richard had always been so proud of was the exact thing that locked them both out of a fortune neither would ever touch. Melissa stood in the doorway after they'd gone, arms wrapped around herself. Dad, you didn't have to give me all of it. Yeah, I said. I did. I put my arm around her, careful of my ribs, and we stood there a while in that little apartment she wouldn't be living in much longer. Not because she was losing it, but because she was finally getting more than she'd ever asked anyone for. Cars can be replaced, she'd told me once, sliding an envelope across a diner table. You can't. Turned out I couldn't be replaced either, not to her. And that was worth more than any number Cornerstone Golf Development ever put on a piece of paper. Somewhere across town that night, my son sat down to figure out how he'd explain to his firm's partners that his $12 million account wasn't nearly enough to save him now, and there wasn't a single soul left in his corner willing to try.